I leaned against the chrome of my Peterbilt, the engine still ticking as it cooled in the humid air of a roadside diner parking lot. Across from me, a woman with silver hair and hands that shook slightly gripped a faded photograph, her eyes darting between the ink on my forearm and the image in her palm. "Sir," she whispered, her voice cracking like dry timber, "my daughter has that same tattoo, the exact same one." I felt a cold surge of adrenaline hit my chest because that mark wasn't just art. It was a unit insignia from a Black Ops extraction team that shouldn't exist on any civilian, let alone a girl who'd been missing for 3 years. Before I could ask her where she'd seen it, a black SUV lurched into the lot, tires screaming, and 3 men with heavy eyes and heavier jackets stepped out, locking onto the old woman with predatory precision. Before we continue, let us know where you're tuning in from. Drop your city and mile marker in the comments. You're watching Highway Stories Untold, and we love seeing how far these stories travel. The sun was a dying ember over the Nebraska plains, casting long, distorted shadows across the asphalt of the triple nickel truck stop. I'd pulled in for a quick bite and a thermos of black coffee, the kind of stop where you keep your head down and your mind on the next 500 miles. I'm Jack Mercer, but most folks on the radio just call me Redline. I've spent more years in a sleeper cab than I have in a real bed, and I've learned that the road has a way of showing you things you'd rather forget. I was sitting at a corner booth, the smell of grease and stale cigarettes heavy in the air, when I noticed her. She was tucked into the booth directly across from mine, an elderly woman in a worn floral dress that had seen better decades. She wasn't eating. She was just staring at a small, rectangular piece of paper, her lips moving in a silent prayer. I've made it a point to mind my own business since I hung up the uniform. In this life, getting involved usually means a delay you can't afford, or a headache that doesn't go away with aspirin. But then I saw the way her hand trembled as she reached for a glass of water, and the way her eyes kept darting toward the heavy glass doors of the diner. She wasn't just lonely, she was terrified. I finished my burger, the meat tasting like cardboard, and stood up to leave. As I walked past her table, the sleeve of my flannel shirt rode up, exposing the underside of my forearm. That's when she saw it. The tattoo is a stylized phoenix wrapped in jagged wire, a mark earned in a place the government still denies we ever visited. She gasped, a sharp, ragged sound that stopped me dead in my tracks. "Sir," she said, her voice barely audible over the hum of the overhead fans. "Please." "My daughter, she has that same tattoo." I froze. My internal clock stopped. That mark was unique to 5 men, 3 of whom were buried in unmarked graves overseas. The 4th was me. The fifth was a man I'd watched take a round to the shoulder before he disappeared into the smoke of a collapsing compound. I looked at the old woman, seeing the desperation etched into the deep lines of her face. I didn't want to get involved. I had a load of electronics due in Denver by sunrise. But the look in her eyes was a point of no return. I sat down across from her, my shadow falling over her small frame. "Where did she get it, ma'am?" I asked, my voice low and steady. She slid the photograph across the Formica tabletop. It was a Polaroid, grainy and poorly lit. It showed a young woman, maybe 25, leaning against a dirty brick wall. Her eyes were hollow, the light behind them extinguished. But there, on her forearm, was the phoenix. It was a crude imitation, a brand rather than a tattoo, but the wire was unmistakable. "She sent this 6 months ago," the woman whispered. "No return address, just a postmark from a town 50 miles north of here. A man came to my house yesterday, Jack. He told me if I didn't stop looking for her, he'd send me something else of hers in a box." My grip tightened on the edge of the table. I could feel the old familiar hum of tactical assessment starting in the back of my brain. I looked out the window and saw the black SUV pull in. It didn't park in a spot. It slanted across the entrance, blocking the flow of traffic. 3 men climbed out. They weren't truckers, and they weren't locals. They moved with a synchronized, aggressive intent that I recognized from a lifetime of bad neighborhoods. The lead man, a tall guy with a shaved head and a leather jacket that couldn't hide the bulge of a piece at his hip, kicked the diner door open. The bell jangled violently. He didn't look at the menu or the waitress. He looked straight at the old woman. I didn't move. I watched them in the reflection of the napkin dispenser. They were confident, loud, the kind of predators who assume the world is full of sheep. Shaved Head walked over to our booth, his boots thudding on the linoleum. He didn't see a threat when he looked at me, just an aging trucker in a faded cap. He leaned over the table, his shadow swallowing the old woman. "I told you what would happen if you left the house, Martha," he said, his voice a low, guttural snarl. He reached out and grabbed her wrist, his fingers digging into her thin skin. "Now you're coming with us. We're going to have a long talk about following instructions," Martha whimpered, her eyes pleading with me, but she stayed silent. She was paralyzed by the kind of fear that robs you of your breath. Shaved Head started to pull her out of the booth. I felt the shift in the air, the moment where the strategic situation changed. If they got her into that SUV, she was a dead woman. There was no retreating from this. I reached out, my hand closing around Shaved Head's wrist like a steel vice. I didn't squeeze yet, I just held him there. "The lady isn't going anywhere," I said, my voice dropping into that calm, flat tone that usually makes smart men reconsider their life choices. He looked down at my hand, then up at me, a smirk twisting his face. "Let go of me, old man," he laughed, signaled to his two partners who were closing in. "Before I break your arm in 3 places." I didn't let go. Instead, I increased the pressure, feeling the small bones in his wrist begin to grind together. The smirk on Shaved Head's face vanished, replaced by a flash of pure, bewildered agony. His two buddies lunged forward, but I was already moving. I stood up, using my body weight to slam Shaved Head's face into the Formica tabletop. A wet crunch echoed through the silent diner. The first accomplice reached for a blade in his pocket, but I caught his thumb, snapped it back until it popped, and drove a palm strike into his throat. He collapsed, gasping for air that wouldn't come. The third man hesitated, his hand hovering over the grip of a pistol tucked into his waistband. "Don't," I said, my voice cutting through the ringing in his ears. "You draw that, and you don't walk out of here, ever." He looked at his boss, who was currently groaning into a puddle of spilled coffee, then back at me. He made the mistake of thinking he was faster than a man with nothing to lose. As his fingers brushed the cold steel, I vaulted over the booth, my heavy work boot connecting with his chest and sending him crashing through a display of glass-bottled sodas. The diner was a wreck of shattered glass and groaning men. Martha was huddled in the corner of the booth, her hands over her mouth, but the terror in her eyes had been replaced by a flickering spark of hope. I grabbed Shaved Head by the collar and dragged him upright, his nose a crimson mess. "The girl in the photo," I growled, shoving the Polaroid in front of his swelling eyes. "Where is she?" He spat blood on my boots and tried to laugh, a wet, rattling sound. "You're dead, trucker. You have no idea whose nest you just stepped in." I didn't waste time on a rebuttal. I felt the vibration of my phone in my pocket, a proximity alert from the dashcam system on my rig parked outside. They had backup. I grabbed Martha's arm gently but firmly. "We have to go. Now." I led her through the kitchen, past a wide-eyed cook, and out the heavy steel back door. The night air was freezing, the wind whipping across the empty fields with a sharpened edge. We reached the Peterbilt, just as 2 more sets of headlights swung into the lot, tires throwing gravel as they skidded to a halt near the SUV. I hoisted Martha into the passenger seat and climbed into the driver's side, the familiar scent of diesel and old leather grounding me. I turned the key and the big cat engine roared to life, a low-frequency rumble that shook the very ground. As I slammed the truck into gear, the first of the new arrivals reached the cab, jumping onto the running board and swinging a heavy flashlight at the window. I didn't flinch. I grabbed his collar through the open crack of the window and used the truck's momentum to swing him off the side as I floored it, the trailer tires screaming as they grabbed the pavement. We weren't just leaving, we were hunting. The high beams of the SUV cut through the dust behind us like twin sabers as I merged onto the interstate. Martha was shivering in the passenger seat, her small hands white-knuckled around the door handle. I reached over and adjusted the heater, the vent blowing a warm gale into the cabin. "Deep breaths, Martha," I said, my eyes flicking between the road ahead and the mirrors. "They want the photograph, and they want you. As long as you're in this rig, they don't get either." But I knew the reality of the situation was far grimmer. The tattoo on that girl's arm wasn't just a coincidence. It was a message, or perhaps a warning. In the old unit, that mark meant property of the shadow. If someone was branding girls with it now, it meant the ghosts of my past hadn't stayed buried. They'd gone into business. I watched the speedometer climb. The 18-wheeler was heavy, but I'd tuned the engine for moments exactly like this. The black SUV was gained ground, weaving through the light evening traffic with reckless disregard. They weren't calling the cops. You don't call the authorities when you've just had your nose pulverized in a diner. They were going to try to run me off the road or shoot out the tires. "Jack," Martha whispered, looking at the side mirror. "There's another one." She was right. A second set of lights appeared from a dark on-ramp a mile ahead, positioning itself to box us in. This was a coordinated intercept. They were strategic, and they were escalating the situation into a tactical pursuit. I felt that familiar cold clarity wash over me, the internal monologue of the trucker being replaced by the rapid-fire assessment of a soldier. "Get down on the floorboards," I commanded. "Now!" She didn't argue. She tucked herself into the footwell just as a muffled pop-pop echoed over the roar of the wind. They were shooting. I saw the side mirror shatter, glass spraying across the door. I didn't swerve. I waited. I needed them close. I needed them to think I was panicked, a trapped animal in a big, slow box. The first SUV pulled alongside my left, the passenger window rolling down. I could see the muzzle flash of a handgun. I slammed on the air brakes for a split second, the trailer bucking and screaming as the sudden drag threw the SUV's timing off. As they surged ahead of my cab, I jerked the wheel hard to the left. The steel grille of the Peterbilt caught the rear quarter panel of the SUV. It wasn't a nudge. It was an irreversible change in their strategic situation. The SUV spun, its tires smoking as it lost grip on the cold asphalt. It barreled into the median, flipping twice before landing in a heap of twisted metal and shattered glass. One down. But the second one was closing fast, and I could see more lights appearing on the horizon behind us. They weren't just a gang, they were a small army, and they'd turned this stretch of Nebraska highway into a war zone. The second SUV didn't hesitate after seeing their partners tumble into the median. They surged forward, their engines screaming as they tried to pull alongside my right side, the blind spot. I felt the heavy vibration of the road through the steering wheel, my hands steady, even as my heart hammered a rhythmic cadence against my ribs. I knew this stretch of road. There was a construction zone 5 miles out where the lanes narrowed to a single path bordered by concrete K-rails. If I could get them there, their mobility wouldn't mean a damn thing. "Are you okay, Martha?" I asked, my voice gravelly. She gave a small nod from the floorboards, her eyes wide and fixed on the dashboard. I reached down and flicked a switch on my console, activating the high-intensity rear-load lights. The back of the trailer erupted in a blinding white glare, momentarily searing the retinas of the driver behind me. I saw him swerve, his tires chirping as he fought to maintain control in the sudden wash of light. But these guys were professionals. They recovered quickly, and I saw the passenger lean out with something much larger than a handgun, a semi-automatic rifle. The first burst of fire chewed through the corner of my trailer, sparks showering the darkness like dying stars. I didn't have the luxury of a Brotherhood arrival yet. Right now, it was just me, 10 tons of steel, and a woman who reminded me too much of the people I'd failed in my past life. I checked the dashcam monitor. It was recording everything, the muzzle flashes, the aggressive maneuvers, the license plates. That little camera was the silent witness that would eventually deliver the justice these men thought they could outrun. But for the dashcam to matter, we had to survive the next 10 minutes. The road began to curve, and the orange glow of construction barrels appeared in the distance. I shifted gears, the transmission groaning as I pushed the Peterbilt to its absolute limit. The SUV tried to wedge itself between my trailer and the concrete barrier, a move of pure desperation or extreme confidence. They were trying to pit maneuver a semi-truck with a mid-sized vehicle. It was a tactical error born of underestimating what a fat trucker is capable of when he's been pushed into a corner. I waited until the exact moment the concrete barrier pinched inward. Then, I didn't just maintain my lane, I claimed theirs. I steered into the SUV. The sound of grinding metal screeched through the cab, a visceral, bone-deep noise that signaled an irreversible change. The SUV was caught between my rear axles and the unyielding concrete. For 3 seconds, we were locked in a deadly embrace of sparks and screaming rubber. Then, the SUV's front tire caught the edge of the K-rail, and the vehicle was launched upward, scraping along the top of the barrier like a discarded toy before it flipped into the dark abyss of the excavated roadbed below. The road ahead was clear, but my mirrors told a different story. 3 more sets of headlights were closing the gap, and they weren't slowing down. They had realized that I wasn't just a witness. I was a combatant. My hands were steady on the wheel, but my mind was racing through the geography of the next 10 miles. I knew there was an old way station, long abandoned and bypassed by the new interstate, tucked behind a screen of cottonwoods. It was a bottleneck, a place where I could dictate the terms of the engagement rather than being hunted in the open. Martha was still tucked in the footwell, her breathing shallow and ragged. I could feel her fear. It was a heavy, tangible thing in the small space of the cab. "Martha, listen to me," I said, my voice low and grounded. "I'm going to take us off the main road. It's going to get rough." I didn't wait for an answer. I checked the mirrors. The 3 remaining SUVs were staggered in a tactical formation, clearly communicating over radio. They thought they had me trapped against the coming bridge over the Platte River. They didn't know I was looking for the narrow gravel turnout that led to the old scales. As the bridge loomed, I saw the faded reflector of the turnout. I didn't signal. I didn't slow down until the last possible second. I slammed the shifter, the transmission howling in protest as I threw the Peterbilt into a controlled skid onto the gravel. The trailer swung wide, a wall of dust and stone erupting behind us, momentarily blinding the lead pursuer. I hauled the rig into the shadow of the abandoned way station building. It was a crumbling brick structure, surrounded by rusting equipment. I brought the truck to a bone-jarring halt and turned off the lights. The sudden silence was deafening, broken only by the ticking of the cooling engine. "Stay here, lock the doors," I whispered to Martha. I reached under the seat and pulled out a heavy tire iron, not because it was my preferred weapon, but because it was an extension of the truck, a tool of the trade. I stepped out into the freezing night. The gravel crunched under my boots as I moved toward the corner of the brick building. I could hear the SUVs slowing down on the gravel road, their engines idling like growling beasts. They knew I was here. They thought they had a cornered trucker. They didn't realize they were walking into a kill zone designed by a man who had survived worse than them in places they couldn't find on a map. The first man stepped out of his vehicle, the dome light illuminating a tactical vest and a high-end radio. He didn't look like a common thug. He looked like a mercenary. He signaled his partners to fan out. I stayed in the shadows, my breathing slow, my heart rate dropping into that combat rhythm where time seems to stretch. This was the point of no return. An irreversible change was coming for these men, and it wasn't going to be recorded on a dashcam until I was finished with the physical work. The lead mercenary moved with a practiced sweep, his eyes scanning the dark space between my trailer and the abandoned scale house. He was looking for a man hiding, not a man hunting. I stayed pressed against the cold brick, the tire iron heavy in my hand. When he stepped past the corner, I didn't hesitate. I stepped into his personal space, my left hand seizing the barrel of his rifle and thrusting it upward, while my right drove the tire iron into the soft tissue of his midsection. The air left his lungs in a wheeze, and before he could recover, I swept his lead leg, slamming him into the frozen gravel with a force that rattled his teeth. The other two men heard the scuffle and turned, their flashlights cutting arcs through the dust. "Movement by the scales!" one shouted. I didn't wait for them to aim. I grabbed the fallen mercenary by his tactical vest and hauled him up as a human shield, retreating toward the darkened gap beneath my trailer. A burst of fire chipped the brickwork where my head had been seconds before. These weren't men looking to make an arrest, they were looking to erase a mistake. I shoved the groaning man toward his partners, using the distraction to dive under the trailer. The smell of grease and road salt was thick. As the two remaining shooters closed in, their boots crunching rhythmically on the gravel, I reached up and grabbed a heavy-duty chain I kept looped near the axles. When the first pair of legs came within reach, I lashed out, the steel links wrapping around an ankle and jerking the man off his feet. He hit the ground hard, his face connecting with the edge of the steel rim. The third man, panicked now, began firing blindly into the undercarriage. Sparks danced off the frame rails, inches from my face. I rolled out the opposite side, using the massive tires for cover. I could hear his ragged breathing as he circled the back of the rig. He was fast, but he was loud. I climbed onto the rear ICC bumper, silent as a ghost, and waited for him to round the corner. As he stepped into view, I dropped from the bumper like a stone, my full weight driving him into the dirt. I disarmed him with a wrist lock that ended in a sickening pop, then finished the engagement with a short, sharp blow that sent him into unconsciousness. The immediate threat was neutralized, but the air was still thick with the smell of ozone and spent brass. I stood up, my chest heaving, and looked back at the cab. Martha was still inside, the silhouette of her head just visible above the dash. I had 3 men down, but the irreversible change I needed was still locked in their leader's head. I walked back to the first man I'd taken down, the one who had initiated the chase at the diner. He was clutching his shattered wrist, his face a mask of sweat and agony in the pale moonlight. I didn't say a word. I simply grabbed him by the tactical vest and dragged him toward the front of my truck, his boots dragging hollowly through the gravel. I slammed him against the radiator grill, the heat of the engine still radiating through his clothes. "Look at the mirror," I commanded, my voice like grinding stones. I pointed to the small, high-definition lens of my dashcam system. "Every shot you fired, every face in your crew, and every license plate is already uploaded to a secure server. If I don't check in within 10 minutes, it goes straight to the Federal Bureau and the state police." His eyes went wide as the realization hit him. He wasn't just fighting a trucker, he was fighting a ghost with a paper trail. You're Mercer," he rasped, his confidence finally disintegrating. "We were told you were just a driver, just a long-haul fossil." "I am a driver," I said, leaning in so close he could see the lack of hesitation in my eyes. "But I'm also the man who knows exactly what that brand on the girl's arm means. You're going to tell me where the holding facility is, or I'm going to let my dog out of the sleeper. And he hasn't been fed since Omaha." I didn't actually have to move. The mere mention of the dog, combined with the crushing weight of the evidence recorded on the dashcam, broke him. He started talking, the words spilling out in a frantic rush. A warehouse near the river, a human trafficking ring using old military insignias to intimidate the girls, thinking no one would ever recognize the mark. I reached into the cab and grabbed a pair of heavy-duty zip ties from my toolkit. I bound him to the wheel of his own wrecked SUV, then did the same for his 2 conscious partners. They weren't going anywhere. I had the location. I had the evidence, and for the first time in 3 years, I had a lead on the girl in the photograph. I climbed back into the driver's seat. Martha looked at me, her face pale but her hands finally still. "Is it over?" she whispered. "Not yet," I said, putting the truck into gear. But the tide just turned. I didn't head for the highway. Instead, I followed the river road, the Peterbilt's headlights cutting through the fog like a search party. The warehouse was exactly where he'd said, a rusted, corrugated box tucked behind a stand of dead oaks. I didn't call the police yet. If I did, the paperwork would take an hour, and these people would be gone in 10 minutes. I shifted into low gear, the truck crawling forward with a predatory hum. "Stay in the sleeper, Martha," I said, my voice leaving no room for argument. "And whatever you hear, don't come out until I open this door." I didn't use the tire iron this time. I used the truck. I backed the trailer up to the main loading dock, then slammed the rig into reverse. The steel ICC bumper punched through the rolling metal door like it was made of parchment, the sound of shrieking iron echoing through the hollow warehouse. I jumped out of the cab before the dust had even settled. Inside, the air smelled of fear and industrial cleaner. 2 guards were scrambling near a row of plywood partitions, their weapons drawn. I didn't give them a chance to find a target. I used the darkness and the debris, moving through the shadows of my own trailer. I came up behind the first man, a quick, brutal strike to the temple, sending him down before he could scream. The second man turned, his eyes wide, but I was already in his space. I disarmed him with a wrist lock that ended in a sickening pop, then finished the engagement with a short, sharp blow that sent him into unconsciousness. I moved toward the back of the room, my heart hammering against my ribs. There, huddled in a corner, were 3 young women, their faces pale and their eyes filled with a hollow, ancient terror. One of them looked up, her arm trembling as she shielded her eyes from my flashlight. On her forearm, the jagged wire of the phoenix was vivid against her skin. "It's okay," I said, my voice dropping into a calm, steady rhythm that felt like a lifetime ago. "Your mother is outside, and the road home starts right here." I stepped back as the warehouse doors groaned, the first light of dawn beginning to bleed through the jagged holes in the metal. The 3 girls moved slowly, like they were waking from a nightmare they weren't quite sure was over. I led them out to the Peterbilt, the engine still humming a low, protective lullaby. Martha was already out of the cab, her knees giving way as she saw the young woman with the phoenix on her arm. They collapsed into each other on the cold gravel, a chorus of sobs breaking the silence of the Nebraska plains. I stood by the driver's side door, my knuckles raw and my chest tight. I didn't join the embrace. I didn't need to. I just watched the way the light hit the girls' faces, the way the terror was slowly being replaced by the realization of safety. I'd spent so much of my life destroying things in the name of duty, but tonight I'd finally built something that mattered. I'd built a bridge back to the world for people who thought they were forgotten. The state troopers arrived 20 minutes later, their sirens muted and their lights flickering against the morning mist. I handed over the flash drive from my dashcam, the silent witness that had recorded every sin those men had committed on the asphalt. I didn't wait for the medals or the interviews. I didn't want the recognition. I just wanted to see Martha one last time. She walked over to me, her daughter's hand gripped tightly in hers. The girl looked at me, her eyes wet but clear. She didn't say a word, but she reached out and touched the tattoo on my arm, then looked at her own. It was a silent acknowledgement of a brotherhood of pain that was finally being traded for a sisterhood of healing. Martha pressed a small, crumpled piece of paper into my hand, a note with a phone number and a simple thank you. "You saved more than just her life tonight, Jack," Martha whispered. I climbed back into the cab, the familiar weight of the road calling to me. I checked my mirrors, watching the 2 of them walk toward the warmth of a waiting ambulance. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a few $100s, sliding it into the envelope Martha had left on the seat earlier. They'd need it for the trip home. I engaged the air brakes, the hiss of the lines sounding like a long-awaited sigh of relief. As I pulled the rig back onto the interstate, the sun finally broke over the horizon, turning the world into a canvas of gold and fire. My hands were steady on the wheel again. The ghosts of the old unit were still there, but they were quieter now, hushed by the sound of a mother's gratitude. I'm just a man with a load of electronics and a deadline in Denver, but for one night, the road wasn't just a ribbon of black. It was a path to redemption. Thank you for watching. And if stories like this one about courage, sacrifice, and second chances speak to you, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support helps us share more incredible true stories that honor the forgotten heroes among us.